Hi, good morning. Welcome to this session on the use of co-creative methodologies. For the observant, I am not Dr. Eleanor Schofield. I am Helen Mears, Head of Curatorship and Research, and it's my privilege to chair today's panel. Just to give you an idea of the panel format, we've got four brilliant speakers. I'm going to introduce them briefly now, and then they'll take it in turns to give us a kind of 5-minute insight into their use of co-creative methodologies in the context of their project. I'll then invite them to see if there are any immediate observations or questions arising from their panelists' presentations, and then we'll open for questions. So please do be thinking of those as we start. So to introduce today's panelists, we have Stuart Jeffrey, who's the Professor of Digital Heritage in the Glasgow School of Art. His recent research projects have strongly focused on community co-design, creative response, immersive systems, visual and acoustic modelling of combined natural/cultural sites. He's published widely on digital heritage, the concepts of aura and authenticity in the digital realm, art in heritage, including 3D visualizations, digital archiving, and community engagement. It's also my pleasure to introduce my former colleague, Jonathan Comby, who's a public historian and researcher. He was previously Research Associate at Royal Museums Greenwich, working on the exhibition and co-design of Unpath'd Waters. His research interests include engagement through digital history, British oral history, and how popular media influences public perceptions of history. Andrew Flynn is a reader in archival studies and oral history and Vice Dean for Postgraduate Research in the Faculty of Arts and Humanities at UCL. He's the Deputy Principal Investigator on the Sloane Lab Discovery Project, Trustee of National Life Stories at the British Library, and current Chair of the UK and Ireland Community Archives and Heritage Group. His research interests include community-based archives, participatory research and ethics, and digital oral history. Thank you. And our final speaker is Alda Terracciano, who's a researcher, visual artist and curator. She's Honorary Senior Research Fellow at UCL and Participatory Design Consultant at the Sloane Lab. Her academic career includes pioneering research on Black and Asian British theatre at Middlesex University, research on digital economy and immersive technologies at Queen Mary, University of London, and creative and visual methods at the University of Sussex, and participatory research methods at UCL. She was the founding chair of Future Histories, the first independent archive of African, Asian, and Caribbean performing arts in the UK, based at Goldsmiths, and director of Alda Terra Projects. Her publications are in the fields of performing arts, critical heritage studies, immersive technologies, and community heritage, and she's exhibited her creative practice nationally and internationally. Welcome, panelists. So shall we start with Professor Stuart Jeffrey?
Thank you very much. Is this on? It is on, okay, excellent. So this is just a short overview of the community co-design processes that we engaged in, actually specifically around the Unpath'd Navigator, which Barney very kindly introduced earlier on. And I want to make the point first off, again reiterating what Barney had said, is that although this work package was led by Glasgow School of Art, it was a close collaboration inside the project with MOLA, Museum of London Archaeology, and also colleagues at National Maritime Museum, so that they'll have their input there. So my work, as you mentioned in the introduction at GSA, focuses a lot on community engagement, but specifically in the domain of VR and XR in recent years. So when we were engaging with the Unpath'd Waters, the question that Barney highlighted around finding new ways of presenting aggregated data and finding new audiences and new ways of reaching those audiences, we decided essentially to explore the affordances of immersive systems in that context, particularly because of the richness of the data that was underpinning these records, which was audio and video and text and 3D modelling, extensive amount of data from the maritime science domain was also part of what was trying to be aggregated by Unpath'd Waters. So what we actually did was we identified three audiences that we'd like to co-design with, each coming from kind of slightly different domains. The first one was we were looking for people who would not naturally be engaging with maritime records, and we kind of termed this as non-coastal communities. And we worked with a group in Galloway-Gens Landscape Partnership, and they were interested in landscapes, so they fitted that role of not being a natural audience for maritime heritage data. I was also particularly interested in cross-disciplinary maritime researchers. There's obviously people who are marine archaeologists who are very engaged with it, but there's also historians who'd be able to access that data, and maritime scientists of all colours. So I was particularly interested in developing a system or co-designing a system with them that might allow the development of a research tool rather than just a dissemination methodology. And we got some great requirements capture from them. But as highlighted by Barney, one of our key targets was looking at accessibility, not just general accessibility, but specific issues of accessibility around people with a visual impairment. And through a quite developed process of workshops and co-design workshops, we actually developed these systems together with the visually impaired community. I think it's really key to say that underpinning all of this, although we had 3 different kind of strands of input into the design process, we'd taken a decision very early on that the visually impaired community's design inputs, cues, and ideas would actually have primacy. So what we were trying to do was not build a system and then retrofit it for people with visual impairments. We were trying to design a system from the ground up for people with visual impairments and see how that might articulate with the requirements for the other groups. So I don't want to go on too long, but I think there's just a couple of reflections that are worthwhile making in this. One is that co-design processes in digital outputs may be fairly well developed. They're not particularly well developed in the virtual reality or immersive systems domain, and they are absolutely not well developed in that domain with people with a visual impairment. And one of the reasons for this is that lots of co-design methodologies or co-creation methodologies you might engage with are simply not practically usable for people with severe visual impairments. So there was a lot of kind of feeling our way forward, and actually we kind of co-created the co-creation process in what we were doing as we went on. Another key reflection in this, which was quite unexpected, well, naively from my point of view, I guess, is that the diversity of visual impairment had a major impact on the ultimate design, because there are lots of different requirements, sometimes counter requirements for people to engage in an immersive system. And what that meant was that there was a lot of focus on initial in-world settings, which we hadn't expected, which was around contrast, text size, colour, vignette, a few of the things that Barney had already mentioned there. And these had to be tailorable. And that ends up, and because that's not a normal process inside virtual reality, that ended up being actually quite a substantial effort of work to undertake in that process. I think, finally, I would say that it was a testament, I think, to the whole design team in that very often when we go into, especially aesthetic or visually amenable technologies, when you start a project, people have lots of different ideas, lots of different notions of how these things are going to look. Actually, I think it was a testament to the whole design team, including our development team, that we were able to respond directly to what our co-designers and participants were telling us. And it is essentially, we had to set aside lots of ideas that we might have had, because our objective was basically to directly serve the audience that we were co-designing with.
Thank you very much. John?
I'm going to pop over there because I have slides. Hey! Hello everyone, I'm Jonathan Comby, as a research associate, formerly of Royal Museum Greenwich. Now, many of you might wonder what a research associate is. I certainly still do. However, I've left my notes over there on the table, but I'll carry on without them. Now, one of the main areas that I was involved in with the co-design with Stuart, thank you, is specifically transcription. Because at the end of the day, when you have a co-design session, how are you then going to use that? How are people going to take all those findings and develop them? So that was essentially my job. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, a little bit about how AI enters into that. Don't worry, I'm not obsessed with the stuff, and I can quit it anytime I want. But now, next one. What kind of transcript purposes do we have for these? I've mentioned a little bit already. We have to convey information, be readable, accessible, record it for future, and also to be comprehensive. Well, yes, but it might depend on what the project itself needs. And therefore, we might prioritize different areas of that. So how do these factors change? Practically, I'll just tell you a little bit about the transcription. We heard a little bit about the co-creation from Stuart. So first of all, I utilized an audio of the co-design session, also using the video component later, but feeding it to a Microsoft caption generator that we'd pre-established. This was roughly about 20,000 to 30,000 words for each 3-hour session, and there was at least, I want to say, 9 sessions, Stuart? 12, there we are. So that is, I think, at least a length of multiple books. Now, we had some issues of traditional transcription. You have time, complexity, and the cost. So what we did do was using the AI to scan it, but however, this means that this text needs to be cleaned. This is really important for attributing contributions to specific co-designers, because if you've ever seen an automated transcript, it is just a block of text. It is almost unusable. So what you then need to do, especially the importance of co-design, is make sure that it is attributed correctly. Now, the issues of AI, though it can save us so much time, AI has a tendency to misread and mishear things. I have some of my favorites later. AI does not like accents. Stuart, of course, was talking about many of our groups from Scotland. This caused a small amount of issues. It cannot be flexible. So co-design, we're using many specific heritage terms, specific tech terms. Lots of the language models don't like this because they work on predicting what is the most common thing that is likely being said in the next sentence. And that doesn't often come up. Next, AI's only context when it's looking at a co-design is the text itself. It can't bring in that external knowledge, or at least the specialist external knowledge that we need. And then finally, AI will catch some oralities. I'll talk a little bit about that later. And this is why cleaning is important. I'll quickly go through my favorite AI examples. So what was said in person was 2 weeks ago, I was going up the rigging of a tall ship in Glasgow, which became 2 weeks ago, I gumtree tool ship in Glasgow. Yeah. A submerged skerry, for those of you not in the world of the maritime, this is more a crash my wallet. This is a kind of a small islandette, essentially. But however, AI like to call it submerged scaries. And then on the conversation of AI, because one of the best things about co-design and our ethical approach to it is continued consent throughout the process. So of course we had this conversation about AI. And when we say we're not bowing down to our AI overlords, it obviously took offense to that. Because we're not going down to our rural overlords is obviously what we meant to say. Now finally, Helen said a little bit in my background, I'm a big researcher into oral history. Now, orality is something you might not have come across if you have. Orality is really the emphasis of things that specifically happen within an oral source. So Alessandro Portelli there, oral sources are oral sources. So in the creation, the transcription turns that oral source into a visual one, which means we lose meaning. And so much so when we're looking at co-design, like that meaning is so important. And finally, We're looking at the importance of the individual because our groups, specifically, we are looking at underserved audiences into heritage. So specifically when you're working with underserved audiences, you come up with issues and challenges that are based around individuals interacting before. Specifically, when you've got like traditionally excluded groups, we need to approach that in terms of ethics. Which, before we go, ethics and existing biases. These things already exist, is what I want to say. A lot of the time we were kind of moving forward, trying to work out what we were doing. But when it came to specifically co-design, transcription, and ethics, a lot of this perspective work has kind of already been done in oral history. What I think we really need to do is, everyone loves the phrase reinventing the wheel. We need to look at our interdisciplinary neighbours, our interdisciplinary co-workers and co-creators here to go, where have these kind of problems evolved before and what can we learn from them? Especially in oral history, the role of the interviewer, the role of the facilitator in a co-design setting is so important, and I think especially with traditionally marginalized groups, we need to presume words. In co-design, we should not presume to tell people what they have to say or have said, which is kind of what a transcript can do in the wrong hands. But yes, if you would like any of the bibliography for my little talk, I recommend having a look at some of the stuff on there. I think I found everything. That should all be generally available. So even if you're at home, you can find that on freely available JSTOR as well. Because as a researcher, I have a hatred of stuff but behind multiple paywalls, which my institution might not have paid for. But yes, thank you very much.
And thank you. Over to Andrew.
Okay, so thank you, and it's a pleasure to be asked to reflect on the participatory and co-design processes undertaken by the Sloane Lab over the course of the past 3 years. I'm going to spend a few minutes outlining the context and the motivations for undertaking participatory work as one of our core activities within the Sloane Lab, and then my colleague Alda will go on to speak in more detail about the actual activities themselves and the outcomes and the challenges. Hopefully this will provoke more questions and discussion after. It's important to also acknowledge that this work was also undertaken by a number of people in addition to myself and Alda, and it's right that they get their credit here too. So within our work package, we had Sloane Lab co-I Nina Perlman, who was co-lead with myself, and working alongside Alda was research assistant Marco Humble. But of course, most of the credit is owed to our hundreds of partners and collaborators, without whose contributions our work quite literally could not have been done. As we heard from Julianne and Andreas yesterday, when they gave their overview of the work, it's important to address the context of the project. In dealing with Sir Hans Sloane, his connections with the transatlantic trade in enslaved peoples, his collections and how they were acquired and from where and by whom. It was and it remains important that we acknowledge that in our project and in our dealings with the collections and its origins. One of the consequences of this acknowledgement was that from the very start we wished to ensure that we engaged with as wide as possible groups of people, including those who from communities connected to and in some cases directly descended from those impacted by the trauma of the trade in enslaved peoples and colonialism more broadly. However, it's also important to say that this history was not the only reason we wanted to embed participatory approaches in the design of the Sloane Lab. At a fundamental level, we wanted to engage a wide range of audiences and publics, and we want in what they might be interested in asking of a digital collection like Sloane, and how and if we could make that possible. Following on from that central precept in how we sought to organise our work, this slide summarises the questions we sought to answer and the actions we took. The collaborative design approach allowed us to involve a range of actors in the co-design, co-testing and co-exploration of the Sloane Lab, aiming to demonstrate how participatory design can lead to a new quality of human-centered digital heritage. Crucially, the participatory data modelling approach ensured that a multiplicity of interpretations and contextualizations of a national collection could be entwined in a machine-readable form. Placing this participatory element at the heart of the Sloane Lab could or should ensure that future search of national digital collections will not be limited to how it's currently modelled and currently understood by curators, librarians, archivists and others. So thus, one of the key questions for the original case for support was how we involve members of the public, researchers, curators and heritage organisations in the contextualisation of individual objects and collections, enabling community-sourced knowledge to enhance and to even challenge existing descriptions and conceptions. And finally, and crucially, and it would be, a happy uncoincidence if we weren't running alongside the ethics panel here, we committed ourselves to conducting this work via a continual and developing consideration of ethical working practices and relationships with our research partners and knowledge contributors, and that was an ongoing and initiative practice. So just very briefly then, just thinking about kind of what all that meant before I hand over to Alda. So the co-design methodology, what does it do, or what did it do for us to enable us to interrogate our collection? It offered us the opportunity to open up the catalogues for wider uses. It drove critical conversations and actions, particularly around questions such as absence, which we heard something about yesterday. It explored new connections and new ways of thinking about those connections across repositories and across the collections. And it moved beyond immediate specialist audiences who were already an audience and an existing audience for the collections, and opened up, or the potential for opening up to new general interested audiences. So Alda will explain in more detail in a minute, but to summarise, engaging with different audiences through participatory co-design, through a collaborative approach, allowed us to do these things. Opened the catalogues, understand community users and stakeholders and their needs, understand how and what they search for. It allowed us to test the usability of what we were producing. It allowed the possibility for challenging narratives and languages that relate to the colonial legacies, and enhanced research capabilities through interdisciplinary research. And just as a final word in my piece before I hand over to Alda, there was also other elements to what we're doing. So we're going to concentrate very much here on the kind of community-focused participatory design. But the work package and the work we were all engaged in also had a number of other elements. We heard about the community fellowships yesterday, which engaged people directly into the research process and designing their own research through the resources that they could access through the lab. And we also had a programme of sectoral engagement to also engage the sector in their needs and their understandings of what we were trying to do. So there was a multifaceted approach to what we were doing. Alda.
Thanks, Andrew. So, yes, following on from what you were saying, we know that when we work with co-design and participatory methodologies, we face not only sometimes lack of technology and legal constraints, especially when we work across, different repositories. But what we also need to deal with is soft factors like trust in technology, the policies, and the incentives for participation. So these are really important issues to consider if we want really to construct aggregators, platforms, digital stores sometimes, which are porous, which are respondent to people different viewpoints, which in the case of the Sloane Lab could also be in contrast with existing Western-derived descriptions and conceptions. So this overarching aim required a multinational not only a multidisciplinary team, but also an interdisciplinary field of research. So using different tools from different disciplines helped quite a lot in creating a kind of holistic approach. We looked into third paradigm feminist human-computer interaction. We used tools from anthropology and ethnographic research, performing arts, critical heritage studies, practice as research, but also because of the nature of the collections and the really important role that obviously, as well as the British Museum, but also the Natural History Museum played in the project, mycorrhizal ecology, forest networking, to really understand what happens, also in the natural world when we want to create mutual relationships, where the benefits are mutual, where we really encounter the other on a level which is meaningful and resonate to what their needs are. So as you were saying, the participatory co-design here had a number of aims, if you want. As Andrew was saying, we wanted to discover new questions, the needs, new understandings around the Sloane collection. We wanted to support usability, and we wanted to test the approach so that this approach could then become shareable at a wider level within the sector. A number of key issues and questions. Obviously, we were there at the forefront of the activities. First of all, how do you convince people that it is very interesting to deal with collections as data rather than objects, right? It is, it might sound not so important, but actually it is, because eventually we are drawn to the material culture. So how do we bridge that? How do we engage people with language, which often is language which is specialist, which does not, again, resonate with people's interests and needs, apart from the few curators and researchers who are specialists in the field. So when we want to open these collections, what are really the challenges that we are facing? And integrating the new questions in the cycle. So as you were saying before, right, to have a cyclical process in co-design, we need to constantly ask people to give us new questions, and then we have to incorporate those new questions in the cycle for the next iteration of activities. And then obviously absences, which were dealt with yesterday. I think I've gone backwards. I think I need to go this way. Yes. So you've seen this slide from yesterday. We did engage with a substantial amount of people. We had basically 8 workshops, focus groups, digital activities, 2 UX focus group workshops, and we engaged with a quite substantial amount of contributions, both online and physical, through physical activities, and engage with people of British Caribbean descent and African descent, experts in data modeling, metadata, and semantics, so Hans Sloane experts and museum curators, botanists, gardeners, seed growers and seed guardians, historians, researchers of the transatlantic slave trade, heritage specialists, staff from the Down County Museum, because the British Museum was obviously developing one of the exhibitions there. So we involved them as well in the co-design process, as well as people from Sir Hans Sloane birthplace in Killyleagh. So a wide range of potential users, not just those we knew already would be interested. And what we also did, we gathered their views through workshops that used material that had been selected in collaboration with those who were more closely in touch with these communities. So the co-design, as you were saying, of the activities as well as of the, of the aggregator was an important factor in the success. We actually had a very substantial number of people, 98% of people who participated in the activity said they had learned something new. So this explained the mutuality. And 97% scored the highest level of enjoyment of the activity, because enjoying what we are doing is fundamental. And the enjoyment comes from the fact that you hear a language which resonates again with you and your needs. So these were at the forefront, really. In terms of outcomes, we designed the activities so that we could feedback straight away to the technical team before stuff would be developed, so that the technical team could really hear people's voices, people's needs, their priorities. And this helped us to increase, our understanding around accessibility, usability, interoperability, but also eventually respond to user requirements and motivations, and also their expectations, which in some cases were very high. So yes, 3 years for a project to do the whole thing was not probably enough. In terms of recommendations, well, we produced 100 plus report on feedback and based on qualitative and quantitative analysis of the data we gathered. And we blocked it around these areas: context, biases, collaboration, interoperability, enrichment, and accessibility. These are the areas where we basically see that work needs to be done so that you can really have a process of co-design that can seriously impact on whatever kind of product is going to be produced, right? Certainly we can say that people ask for nuanced understandings of working with collections. We cannot have just one view. We need to allow for a multiplicity of voices. We need to acknowledge the epistemological challenges of working with biased collections. And we need to facilitate a process of working collaboratively, which means equal relations, which means paying for people's contribution and time, which means for using a language which is responding to people's sensitivities, counteract the siloed nature of the collections. We learned the importance of actually bringing, the collections to elements of the collections at the British Museum, the Natural History Museum, the British Library, in contact with each other and with the outside world. So the internal and external interoperability. And then people were mad about this importance of visual aids. Visual aids are so crucial. It is interesting that actually what you are saying about, obviously, how do you design for people who are, visually impaired, but then for those who might have other forms of impairment, actually visual aids are really crucial, really helpful. And absolutely, whenever we design anything, intuitive links, something that is, very easy to access online. So what have we learned? Well, we have learned so much. I can't really, and I think I'm done with my 5 minutes. But the iterative reshaping, listening deeply to what people are saying, speaking nearby when you deliver activities, as Trinmina taught us back in the 80s, and creating really when we work, especially with this amount of funding, right, which doesn't come across that often, we need to make sure that it's transferable, that our learning is transferable, that we put it down in ways that can go out to those professionals in the field so that this becomes shared knowledge. Thank you so much.
So, thank you, Olga, and thank you, panellists. I thought I'd just kind of pull out, there seem to be a couple of emerging areas of tension that we might productively look at, and I think one's around that the intersections between people, systems and processes, and about how often digital systems are about the accommodation of need rather than what I think you were pushing towards around a more human-centred design for technology. We also heard, we talk a lot about communities, but I think we heard a bit about the kind of multiplicity of stakeholders, and often very, who are motivated by have very different motivations, very different incentives, very different needs, and how we might not accommodate, how we might best meet those different needs. That seemed to come across very strongly. The importance of context, both in terms of communities and collections. And then I think also that important point about how you ensure, to use your term, Alda, mutuality and equity in the context of a short-term, externally funded research project. So those are my immediate reflections and points of tension. I wonder if panellists, you had any immediate responses to that or to each other's presentations before we open out.
Thanks very much for that, and thanks also panelists for the oversights there. I'm just returning to the point you were making about the diversity of requirements. So in the co-design process, and this is I'd like to ask a question of you guys as well about these quite large groups of people that you're having involved in the process. Because one of the things that we come up against quite frequently in any kind of co-design process, and particularly actually with the VIPs, I've already mentioned kind of diversity of impairment, but there is also diversity of outlooks and requests and backgrounds. And the co-design process is a kind of wrangling process around there. And part of the issues around equitability is obviously making sure that everybody's voice is heard. But ultimately, when you're producing something, something has to be produced. And it's never actually going to reflect every possible desire or opinion and so on. And actually, it can be a tricky business, but it's a very, very important business, making sure people are heard, making sure people understand what the process is, so that they understand if they really, really want something, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen, because we're trying to manage the whole group. And I think that's a really important point, and it's it's a challenge, I'll say that.
I can say something. I think it's really interesting to continue from that. When it comes to co-design, I think we definitely found it was very difficult to get people to design for themselves. Everyone wants to go, well, this might be good for someone else. And you're like, but what about you? Well, I don't want to talk about myself. But and so it became really interesting, especially with the visually impaired people. One of the first and very ardent and important areas that came up was because a lot of accessibility for visually impaired people comes from sound. And so one of the first elements came, but what about people who are visually impaired who also have hearing impairments? And that's a really important area. However, it's also really sad that when we're looking at that, it's like we can't do both of these at once. Just by the nature, you said 3 years wasn't enough. I don't know how much time would be enough, really. But it's just something that I think it's important, because especially a lot of my focus is on recording all this, is making sure that these as discovery projects are something that can then, that these areas are highlighted, so that then when we're going forward, we're going, okay, these are what we like, these are the lessons that we're learning, and what can we bring forward? What can we bring to like a much more like mutual understanding of histories and co-design?
Yeah, I mean, building on that, I think what we were understanding from the very beginning is obviously we can't bring everybody into the co-design process, and we can't bring even representatives of every potential community that might be interested, let alone thinking about the diversities within those communities. So it was always, and it always has to be, whatever the timescale, a kind of partiality of responses that you get. But the idea, I suppose, is to see how systems that are generally designed primarily with either a very kind of specific group of researchers in mind, or actually more often they're designed with the interests of the curators and archivists and librarians who make them. If we open it up to other groups as representatives of a wider general audience, what might they want, and how can we then look at how we change the system to reflect the lessons that we can learn from those people, rather than saying, well, this shows that we meet the audience needs of all these people. But taking up on that, then I think it is really important that we think about how we, within these short-term projects, how we make those contributions that not all can necessarily then be enacted into the design, but that we make sure that the lessons go forward in something. And I think this will be Alda's, made point on that. But that nature of, how do we make this not just extractive when we make all those promises, but then a project ends and the connections are broken? There has to be something of that learning and the contribution people have made that has to go forward.
Yeah, can you, yeah, is it working? I think as an activist, I have learned that things don't necessarily happen just after you have marched, just after you have, fought for your rights. Things are cumulative. The processes are cumulative, and that's the reason why sharing learning, creating conferences like this, but also going beyond the conference, right? Learning how we can learn from each other, we can learn from those behind us and in front of us, right? How we explore these temporalities as a much longer process, yeah? And in this longer process, how do we ensure that the work that has been done is not lost? The work that has been done is a step towards learning how to make sure that people with both, visual and oral impairment, et cetera, but we can talk about anything in that context. And the other point is really, we are working towards centralization here, but we also need to understand our positionalities as researchers as, in response to the need to decentralize us. When we do co-design, we really need to decentralize the position of the researcher. We need to make sure that we allow, yes, we might not hear all the voices, but we might hear some significant voices. And in order to really hear those significant voices, we need to be on the side. And this being on the side, this positionality, which also reflects the fact that we are users as well as creators. We as researchers, we use these resources as well as them, right? So this possibility of going beyond the usual hierarchies of knowledge making is really fundamental if we want truly co-design digital tools that are not going to be oppressive systems.
Thank you, Alda. I'm going to, Stuart, you wanted to come back to that, and then we'll open for questions. So do you think of those? Yes, Stuart.
Thanks. I just wanted to very, very briefly respond to a couple of things. One was picking up on the point that was made about co-design participants trying to design for other people, and just to reinforce the point, that longitudinal engagement is really, really important in the co-design process. This is not a kind of hit and run process. It can take quite a long time. And our co-design process would be 18 months to 2 years, and I guess yours was similarly. And one of these things, this is a well understood process where when you first engage with co-designers, they are trying to find out what you want to do to reflect it back to you. And it's very difficult to shortcut that process without having a reasonable period of time and revisiting. And I also just want to make another point regarding this issue around competing voices and different opinions and how that works. It's a bit of a kind of hobby horse of mine, but one of the ways you can counter this, or one of the ways we tried to counter this, is by being super explicit about authorship. So rather than having kind of corporately produced or program, and it's called the Unpath'd Navigator, but if you go into the Unpath'd Navigator, all the acknowledgements, all the co-design team are basically, it's really explicit who is involved in what. And so that's not like laying the blame at them because they made the co-design. What it is saying is that this is a human process, and these are the humans involved in that process.
Sorry. gives you more time to think for questions. But I think it's really interesting. It was talking back to your idea of like the significance of people's voices. That's why I think I focus so much on transcripts, is by cleaning a transcript, by focusing on the transcript, the transcriber is ultimately in control of those voices, which is really, it's a really hard thing to democratize, because it's the really boring work at the end of the project that, well, as you were saying, it's great for people to have fun. I enjoy my job, but yeah, transcription is sometimes very hard and very like overwhelming in terms of just the amount of information. So I think very much that kind of idea of like making it just very clear, like the amount of points, our own knowledge, the transcriber's the transcriber's identity, the people's identity within it, that is all going into that. And reiterate to everyone, a transcript should always be used in connection to the video, the recording itself. I know that we all like to use them because they're great research tools. You can control F a transcript, but so often there are bits that are lost because of it.
Great, thanks.
Very, very quickly, just to say, this is the reason why we had both online forms and transcriptions of conversations, because we wanted also to give people the opportunity to write in their own words. And then we would have the discussion and we would transcribe those discussions. All right? So working on a multiplicity of, media also helps.
We did have that as well. Just saying, I just wasn't in charge of it.
Okay, I'm very keen. I know there will be burning questions and points. So we've heard about control, authorship. Are there questions out there that you would like to, or points that you would like to make, those in the audience or online? Are there any questions? Yes. Oh.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much. I just wonder, and I might get myself in trouble in this, and I'm very, very happy to get myself in trouble. But does the panel think that we made the projects made sufficient allowance for the resource that was required for co-design, and in terms both of money and the sort of the sheer amount of time it takes, and secondly in terms of the programming, when in the project it starts, and in order to deliver to the objectives. I'm not quite sure we got it right. I don't know if anyway. I just thought you might be able to reflect on that.
I can go before you respond directly to that. So I think all those points are really important. I think in terms of the financial resources, we built that into our bid. And had an understanding of that's what we wanted to be able to pay participants and build that in. But in terms of time, absolutely not. No, the way that we constructed the process, I'm sure it's similar, took a long time to get up and running because we were working through, we were designing, we were thinking through, we were working with people. So the startup time was long, and then the process itself takes time, takes 18 months, 2 years, and we're at the 3-year point. And we fed into the design all the way through, but actually there was really important points that were coming through from the design, from the participatories, which that we were running hard against the ending of the project and the timetable. And actually, to do this work, it can't really function as effectively as it could do within time-limited projects that put a hard stop to things.
Can I briefly add that it's also important when budgeting I know that we always have to match against one type of activity and making sure that, and this is also the constraint of a funding system that does not allow, when it comes to participation and co-design, for the unpredictable, for what is needed because it's coming from the public, it's coming from the participants. There's something that should be, budgeted for whatever is important. Now, within our project, it was possible at some point to allocate a fair amount of money for a symposium organized by the Decolonizing the Archive, produced by them, obviously in consultation with us, which was incredibly successful. Incredibly successful. So, and in terms of, you know, the participation, but also the quality of the discussion, etc. So having that built in the project funding is really important if one really is serious about co-design.
Yeah, so just to respond to Barney directly on Unpath'd, I mean, I think just as a kind of overall thing, there's never enough time, enough money. We're familiar with that. I think if there was a lesson learned from that, it was about the nature of the project being a national project and our commitment in engaging with communities. So we were working with people in Galloway and people in London and people in York and so on, and that there's a clear overhead in that you can't get around. But that also has to be balanced. We're all in favour of longitudinal support, and obviously we're in terms of our relationships with it, we're being non-extractive, and we're you know, paying the participants and so on. We have to bear in mind that the participants have their own lives. Yeah, so there's a real balance here in how demanding you can be with your participants, even though, you know, they're being recompensed. They've got their time and they've got other interests. They are not obviously as invested in as long the project as you are, and that's a very careful balance. So you've not to basically. I'd like to have multiple projects all the time, running constantly. It's not fair. It's not a fair ask of many community groups.
John, do you want to respond briefly?
Just quickly. Because everyone else has said something, I wanted to. No, specifically when we're talking about the digital outputs for these co-designs, like, it is very much trying to build a house opposite a ship. It is, for the nautical method, like, digital develops so fast. A wonderful developer, who we haven't mentioned by name before, Maria Katuna, who's in the audience, did an absolutely wonderful job of working with everyone's requirements and trying to implement the ideas. However, when you're working with a digital output, like one of the great examples, it was developed in Unity. Whilst we were developing it, Unity came out with its own automated, Stuart can talk a little bit. It's very, very short. Go.
Sorry, that was so. The text-to-speech development became a native piece of functionality in Unity after the project had started, and we decided not to use it. And that actually was a really good decision, because it turns out for visually impaired people, there is lots of issues around speech-to-text, which aren't just to do with its native functionality. It's kind of to do with tone of voices and that type of approach. And I also just want to make thank you for mentioning the developer, our developer Maria there, is that one of the responses that we did immediately was it became very clear working with the community groups as they felt that the researchers might be mediating between you and the actual, between them and the developer. So they were saying, well, it's really important that the developers in the room, and actually we responded to that, and Maria got really engaged in the actual co-design process and was in the room responding directly at the time. And I've never done that before. That was the first time that we've actually had a developer in the process.
Right. I realise we're quickly going to run out of time, but I know there's certainly a question online.
Is your aim not to give people the tools so they can accommodate their own needs, so everybody can be included?
No, people were accessing the tools. I mean, you know, we to give you an example, when we were working around visualizations, because people were talking about the importance of visualizations, I did something, I sat down with the developer, Daniele Metilli, who is not here, unfortunately, one of the members of the technical team, and I asked him to print out the actual visualizations that the software would create, right? So that digital tool that is there. And then I printed it, I cut it. And I cut it together with loads of other things that would refer to Sloane Lab, you know, to Sloane collections, and etc. And we had one of the activities, which was basically asking people to do a collage, a creative collage of the visualization that they would have liked, right? And people loved the activity because it was possible to actually take something that is very abstract, very difficult to understand. How would you program, you know, visualizations tools, etc., from that kind of software, you know, and you bring it down to what people can do. They help the process of understanding how the visualization would work in relation to their search. They would create something, and then out of that, we would extract the information that would go to the designers and the programmers so that they could develop the tools along the wishes or the needs or the expectations and requirements of those participants, right? So it is about giving the tools, but in the way that people can use them. Otherwise, there's no point, right? You give something to people that they can't use, then those tools will remain foreign to them.
Thank you, and thank you all. I'm really sorry, but I'm under strict orders to keep us on time, so I understand that it is lunch now, and I just need to flag up that there is a workshop for the Congruence engine in a space, it says SOD, I don't know, and there is also the interactive digital display for Unpath'd Waters, Space 3. So I encourage you to participate in those. And also, if you have questions, I'm resolved to ask them directly of our panelists, to nab them over lunch. But just to thank our panelists again for their insightful and provocative presentations. Thank you very much.